Who were the Vikings? When most people hear the word Viking, they picture helmeted warriors leaping from longships onto misty shores, torches in hand, chaos in their wake. That image is not entirely wrong, but it is only a small part of a much richer story. The Vikings were farmers, traders, explorers, poets, and craftspeople. They built cities, discovered continents, and shaped the political map of Europe in ways that still echo today. To understand them properly, we have to go back to the beginning, to the cold, forested peninsula of Scandinavia, where a culture forged by harsh landscapes and limited resources would eventually send its sons and daughters across the known world. The term Viking comes from the Old Norse word vikinga, which likely referred to a raider or pirate, possibly derived from vik, meaning a bay or inlet. Not everyone from Scandinavia was a Viking in this strict sense. The vast majority of Norse people never raided at all. They lived quiet lives on farms, fished the rivers and fjords, and traded with their neighbors. But the warriors who did set out on raids, who became synonymous in the minds of their victims with sudden violence and terror, gave their entire civilization its most lasting name. The Vikings came primarily from three regions we now call Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Each group had its own tendencies and patterns of movement. The Norwegians tended to sail west, colonizing Scotland, Ireland, Iceland, Greenland, and eventually reaching the shores of North America. The Danes raided and eventually settled in England and northern France. The Swedes pushed east, traveling through the river systems of what is now Russia and Ukraine, trading with the Byzantine Empire and the Abbasid Caliphate. These were not random choices. They reflected geography, the availability of sea routes, and the economic opportunities each direction offered. Before we can understand the Vikings, we need to understand the world they came from, the landscape that made them. Scandinavia is a land of extremes. The Norwegian coast is one of the most dramatic in the world, a jagged frontier of deep fjords, rocky islands, and mountains that plunge directly into the sea. The interior is largely mountainous and covered with dense forests. Farmable land is scarce, tucked into narrow valleys and along coastal strips where the soil is thin and the growing season is short. For a farming community, this was a harsh environment. Every summer had to be used to its fullest, and every family lived with the knowledge that a bad harvest could mean starvation before spring. Denmark, by contrast, is relatively flat and fertile. Its position at the base of the Scandinavian peninsula made it a natural crossroads for trade between the Baltic Sea to the east and the North Sea to the west. Danish farmers had better land and easier access to the sea lanes of northern Europe. This geographic advantage would later translate into political power. Denmark would become the dominant Scandinavian kingdom of the Viking Age. Sweden occupies the middle ground with a mix of forests, lakes, and agricultural land. Its most important geographic feature for the Viking story is its access to the Baltic Sea and, through a network of rivers, to the vast interior of Eastern Europe. Swedish merchants and warriors would exploit these routes extensively, traveling deep into Russia along the Volga and Dnieper rivers. The sea was the defining element of Viking life. In a landscape where overland travel was slow and difficult, the water was the highway. The Norse people became the finest sailors and shipbuilders of their age, developing technologies and techniques that allowed them to navigate the open ocean with a confidence no other European civilization could match. Their ships were not just tools of war, they were the foundation of an entire economy and culture. The climate of Scandinavia during the early Viking Age was slightly warmer than today, a period known as the medieval warm period, which made agriculture somewhat more productive and may have contributed to a population increase. More mouths to feed on the same limited land created pressure to find new resources, whether through trade, colonization, or raid. Society and social structure. Viking society was organized around the family and the clan. The basic unit was the household, which included not just the nuclear family, but extended relatives, servants, and sometimes thralls, enslaved people, usually captured in raids or warfare. The household was largely self-sufficient, producing its own food, clothing, and many of its tools. Above the household was the local community, centered on the thing, a public assembly where free men gathered to settle disputes, make laws, and discuss community matters. The thing was one of the most important institutions in Norse society. It was a form of democratic governance, remarkably sophisticated for its time, in which free men had a voice in the decisions that affected their lives. Disputes could be brought before the assembly for judgment, and decisions were made by consensus or by the weight of community opinion. The thing was not just a legal institution. It was a social gathering, a marketplace, and a religious festival all at once. Viking society was hierarchical. At the top were the jarls, powerful chieftains and nobles who commanded warriors, owned large amounts of land, and wielded political power. Below them were the carls, free farmers and craftspeople who formed the backbone of Norse society. At the bottom were the thralls, enslaved people who had no legal rights and could be bought and sold like property. The relationship between a jarl and his followers was built on loyalty, gift-giving, and mutual obligation. A successful leader was expected to be generous, to share the spoils of raids and trade with his warriors, to host great feasts, and to provide for his people. In return, his followers owed him their swords and their loyalty. This culture of generosity and reciprocity is vividly described in Norse poetry, where the ideal lord is always described as ring giver or gold friend. Women in Norse society had considerably more rights and freedoms than women in most other contemporary cultures. A Norse woman could own property, inherit wealth, initiate divorce, and manage a household in her husband's absence. When the men were away on raids or trading voyages, which could last months or years, women ran the farms, made economic decisions, and held the community together. There were even, according to sagas and some archaeological evidence, women who fought as warriors, though this remains a subject of scholarly debate. Norse religion and mythology. To understand the Viking mindset, you have to understand Norse religion. The Norse people were pagans who worshipped a complex pantheon of gods, believed in a richly detailed cosmology, and placed enormous value on honor, courage, and a glorious death in battle. The Norse cosmos was structured around Yggdrasil, the world tree, an immense ash tree whose roots and branches connected 9 different worlds. At the center of the divine world was Asgard, home of the gods. The human world was Midgard, literally middle enclosure. Below the roots lay Hel, the realm of the dead who died of sickness or old age, and Niflheim, a realm of ice and mist. There were also realms of giants, elves, and dwarves. The chief god was Odin, the All-Father, a complex and often terrifying figure associated with wisdom, war, death, and poetry. Odin was not a comfortable god. He was a wanderer and a seeker, willing to sacrifice anything, including one of his own eyes, in the pursuit of wisdom and knowledge. He was the patron of kings and warriors, but he was also unpredictable and not above deception. Norse warriors who fell in battle might be chosen by Odin's warrior maidens, the Valkyries, to be taken to Valhalla. Odin's Great Hall, where the chosen dead spent their days feasting and fighting, preparing for the final battle of Ragnarok. Thor was perhaps the most beloved of the Norse gods among ordinary people. The son of Odin, Thor was the thunder god, powerful, direct, and fiercely loyal. His great hammer Mjolnir was the ultimate weapon, capable of destroying giants and protecting the world of gods and humans from chaos. Thor was a god of the common people, a defender who faced his enemies head-on without the cunning and ambiguity of his father. Amulets in the shape of Thor's hammer have been found throughout the Norse world, worn as protective symbols much as Christians wore crosses. Loki was the trickster, a shapeshifter and agent of chaos who was neither fully evil nor fully good. He was responsible for both helping the gods and bringing about their greatest disasters. Ultimately, it was Loki who would help trigger Ragnarok, the apocalyptic battle that the Norse believed would one day destroy the gods and remake the world. The Norse believed that a warrior's greatest achievement was to die bravely in battle, earning a place in Valhalla. This belief had profound practical implications. It meant that Viking warriors did not fear death in the same way that many of their opponents did. It meant that courage and aggression in battle were not just practical virtues, but religious ones. A warrior who fought ferociously and died bravely was fulfilling his highest spiritual obligation. This does not mean that Vikings were reckless. They were skilled, disciplined fighters, but it does mean that the cultural framework in which they operated actively encouraged boldness and aggression. Burial practices reflected these beliefs. Wealthy and powerful Vikings were often buried with their most valued possessions, weapons, jewelry, tools, even ships. In some cases, animals and human beings were sacrificed and buried alongside the dead. The most spectacular Viking burials, like the Oseberg ship burial in Norway, give us an extraordinary glimpse into a world of tremendous artistic sophistication and deep ritual meaning. The art of shipbuilding. If Norse religion gave the Vikings their psychological edge, their ships gave them their strategic edge. The Viking longship was one of the great technological achievements of the medieval world. A vessel that could cross the open ocean, navigate shallow rivers, be carried overland between waterways, and land on beaches without a harbour. The key to the longship's brilliance was its construction technique. Norse shipwrights used a method called clinker building, in which overlapping planks of oak were riveted together to create a flexible hull that could flex and move with the waves rather than fighting them. This flexibility was crucial for ocean sailing. A rigid hull would crack under the stress of heavy seas. A flexible hull absorbed the energy and survived. The planks were caulked with tar-soaked wool or animal hair to make them watertight. The longship's design was elegant in its simplicity. It was long and narrow, typically 20 to 30 meters in length but only 3 to 5 meters wide, which gave it exceptional speed in the water. It had a shallow draft, meaning it could sail in very shallow water, crucial for navigating rivers and landing on beaches. It was symmetric, meaning it could sail forward or backward with equal ease, enormously valuable in confined spaces. And it had both oars and a sail, giving it propulsion options in any wind condition. The sails of Viking ships were made of wool, often woven in a distinctive striped or plaid pattern. Wool was chosen because it held its shape better than linen when wet and could be treated with lanolin to improve its wind resistance. The mast was hinged so it could be lowered quickly when approaching shore or when the ship needed to pass under a low bridge or through shallow water. Different types of ships served different purposes. The longship was the iconic warship, fast, low-slung, and terrifying. But the Vikings also built nars, broader-beamed and deeper-keeled cargo vessels designed for carrying trade goods across open water. The nar was the workhorse of Viking commerce, enabling the long-distance trade networks that were just as important as the raids in shaping Norse civilization. Building a longship required enormous resources and skill. A single ship might use the timber from dozens of large oak trees, all carefully selected and shaped. The construction process was passed down through generations of master shipwrights, who carried the knowledge in their heads and hands. The shipyard was one of the most important centers of any Norse community, and a lord who could commission a great ship was demonstrating his wealth and power. The first raids, a new threat emerges. The Viking Age is conventionally said to have begun on June 8, 793, with the raid on the monastery of Lindisfarne off the northeastern coast of England. The attack came without warning. Ships appeared from the sea, warriors leaped ashore, and within hours a community that had considered itself safe was destroyed. The monks who survived described the raiders as a most vile people who, like stinging hornets, had overrun the country in all directions like fierce wolves, plundering, tearing and killing not only beasts of burden, sheep and oxen, but even priests and deacons and companies of monks and nuns. The attack on Lindisfarne shocked the Christian world. Monasteries and churches were supposed to be sanctuaries. Even in warfare, they were traditionally protected. The Norse raiders did not share this understanding. To them, a monastery was simply a wealthy, poorly defended target. The precious objects accumulated by centuries of Christian devotion, silver crosses, illuminated manuscripts, gold reliquaries, were exactly the kind of portable wealth that raiders sought. But Lindisfarne was not quite the bolt from the blue it appeared. The Norse had been trading and raiding along the coasts of northern Europe for decades before 793. Earlier attacks had occurred in what is now France and possibly England, but they had not made the same impression on historical memory. Lindisfarne was different because it struck at the heart of Christian culture, a monastery of international fame, associated with the great missionary Cuthbert. Why did the raids begin when they did? Historians have proposed several explanations, and the answer is probably a combination of factors. Population pressure is one. The limited farmland of Scandinavia may have been struggling to support a growing population, pushing younger sons, who would not inherit their father's land, to seek their fortunes elsewhere. Political fragmentation is another. Scandinavia in this period was divided among many small chiefdoms, and unsuccessful or dispossessed warriors had every incentive to seek wealth through raiding. The weakness of the Frankish Empire under Charlemagne's successors, the political instability of England, and the generally undefended nature of coastal monasteries all made Europe an attractive target. The technological factor should not be underestimated. The development of the full ocean-going longship gave Norse warriors capabilities that their victims simply could not counter. There were no coastal defense forces capable of intercepting Viking ships at sea. By the time a raid was spotted, it was usually too late to mount an effective defense. The speed of the ships meant that raiders could strike and disappear before any organized response could be assembled. The mechanics of a raid. What actually happened during a Viking raid? The process was more organized and calculated than the popular image of wild chaos might suggest. A raiding expedition began months before the first ship left port. A jarl or successful warrior would gather a crew, typically 30 to 60 men for a single longship, though larger expeditions might involve dozens of ships. These men were not simply mindless thugs. Many were experienced farmers and craftspeople who spent most of their year in peaceful occupations. The raid was a seasonal enterprise, usually conducted in the spring and summer when the weather was favorable and the crops had been planted but not yet needed to be harvested. The crew invested their own resources in the voyage. They contributed to the ship's provisioning and expected a share of whatever was taken. The relationship was quasi-commercial, a joint venture with violent means. A leader who consistently brought home good plunder could attract better warriors. One who led failed raids would quickly find himself without followers. Navigation was by a combination of methods. The Norse developed a remarkable understanding of celestial navigation, reading the position of the sun and stars to maintain direction. They also read natural signs, the flight patterns of birds, the color of the water, the direction of ocean swells, the presence of seaweed, to gauge their position. A solar compass, a wooden disc with a gnomon, may have helped them determine true north even on cloudy days. These techniques, refined over generations, allowed Norse sailors to navigate with confidence across the open North Atlantic. Arriving at a target, the raiders would typically land at dawn or just before. Speed and surprise were essential. A successful raid was over in hours. The warriors would strike, take everything of value that could be carried, and be back at sea before any organized defense could arrive. Resistance was dealt with violently, but the primary goal was plunder, not killing for its own sake. Captives were valuable. Enslaved people were one of the most important commodities in the Viking economy. Skilled craftspeople, young women, and strong men could be sold in the slave markets of Dublin, York, or the distant eastern trading cities. The trade in human beings was one of the darker aspects of Viking commerce. Though it was not unique to the Norse, slavery was widespread throughout the medieval world. The targets: why England, Ireland, and France? The geography of the early raids was not random. The Norse raided where the rewards were greatest and the resistance weakest. England, in the late 8th century, was divided among several Anglo-Saxon kingdoms: Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Wessex, each jealous of the others and rarely capable of coordinated defense. The coastline was long and largely undefended. Monasteries and churches were wealthy by the standards of the time, filled with treasures accumulated over centuries of Christian devotion. The English had no standing navy and no early warning system for coastal raids. Ireland presented similar opportunities. The island had no centralized political authority. It was divided among dozens of petty kingdoms and clans that spent much of their energy fighting each other. Irish monasteries, like their English counterparts, were centers of wealth and learning, but not of military power. The coast of Ireland was deeply indented with bays and rivers that a longship could navigate easily. The Norse found Ireland so attractive that they returned again and again, eventually establishing permanent settlements, including the towns that would become Dublin, Wexford, Waterford, Cork, and Limerick. France, or the Frankish kingdom, as it was then, was a more complex target. The Franks under Charlemagne had built a powerful empire, but by the early 9th century, that empire was fragmenting under the pressure of inheritance disputes and civil wars. The great rivers of France, the Loire, the Seine, the Garonne, were highways into the interior, and Norse longships proved perfectly capable of navigating them. Paris was raided for the first time in 845, when a fleet of over 100 ships sailed up the Seine and threatened the city until King Charles the Bald paid an enormous ransom to make them go away. The ransom payment to the Vikings, known as Danegeld, would become a recurring pattern. When military resistance proved impossible, European rulers discovered that paying the raiders to leave was sometimes cheaper than fighting them. This was a rational calculation in the short term, but it had the unfortunate effect of demonstrating that raiding was profitable, which encouraged more raiding. The Great Heathen Army and the Conquest of England. By the middle of the 9th century, the nature of Viking activity in England was changing. The early hit-and-run raids were giving way to something more ambitious: conquest and settlement. In 865, a massive force landed in East Anglia that the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle called the Great Heathen Army. This was not a typical raiding expedition. It was a coordinated military campaign involving warriors from across Scandinavia, probably numbering in the thousands. The army was led, according to later tradition, by the sons of the legendary warrior Ragnar Lothbrok, Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and others. Whether or not the Ragnar Lothbrok legends are historical, the army that invaded England in 865 was real, formidable, and determined. The Great Heathen Army spent the next decade systematically destroying the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Northumbria fell in 866 when the army captured York. East Anglia fell in 869. Its king, Edmund, was captured and killed, becoming a Christian martyr. Mercia was attacked repeatedly and eventually forced to sue for peace. By 874, only Wessex under King Alfred remained unconquered. The war between Alfred and the Danes is one of the great stories of the Viking Age. Alfred was nearly destroyed in the winter of 878 when the Danish leader Guthrum launched a surprise attack that forced the English king to flee into the marshes of Somerset with a handful of followers. From this low point, commemorated in the famous legend of Alfred burning the cakes, though that story is almost certainly fictional, Alfred rebuilt his forces, trained a new kind of army, and at the Battle of Edington in May 878 defeated Guthrum so decisively that the Danish leader agreed to be baptized Christian. The result was the Treaty of Wedmore, which divided England between the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and the Danelaw, the vast region of northern and eastern England under Danish control. This was not simply a military settlement. Over the following decades, the Danes who had settled in England began to intermarry with the local population, convert to Christianity, and integrate into English society. The Danelaw became a hybrid culture, Norse and English at once, which left lasting traces in the English language. Hundreds of everyday words, including sky, knife, egg, window, husband, and happy, are of Old Norse origin. The settlement of Ireland and the founding of Dublin. While the Danes were carving out their territories in England, the Norwegians were doing something equally significant in Ireland. What began as raiding evolved into permanent settlement. The Norse established their first fortified camps in Ireland in the 830s and 840s. These long forts, literally ship enclosures, were defensive bases where ships could be harboured and warriors could overwinter rather than returning to Scandinavia each year. The Long Fort at Dublin, established around 841, would grow into the most important Norse settlement in Ireland and eventually into the capital city of the country. The Norse interaction with Ireland was complex and not simply one of victor and victim. The Irish were not passive. They fought back, sometimes successfully, and there were prolonged periods of conflict interrupted by phases of alliance and intermarriage. Irish kings sometimes allied with Norse leaders against other Irish kings. Norse leaders converted to Christianity and intermarried with Irish noble families. The culture that emerged from this interaction was neither purely Norse nor purely Irish. It was something new. Dublin in the 9th century was already becoming a significant urban centre, one of the first true towns in Ireland, which had previously been a land of monasteries and rural settlements. The Norse built a town on the south bank of the Liffey, with streets, markets, workshops, and docks. Excavations in modern Dublin have revealed a remarkable picture of Viking urban life: houses, tools, ships, and personal possessions that paint a vivid portrait of a cosmopolitan trading community. The slave trade was central to Dublin's economy. Norse raiders captured thousands of Irish, English, Welsh, and Scottish people and sold them in Dublin's slave market. From Dublin, enslaved people were shipped to markets throughout the Norse world and beyond, to Iceland, to the trading cities of Scandinavia, and along the eastern river routes to the markets of the Islamic world. It is one of the most disturbing aspects of Viking civilization, and one that is sometimes glossed over in romantic retellings of the Norse story. The character of the age. By the end of the 9th century, the Viking Age was in full swing. Norse raiders and settlers had established themselves in England, Ireland, Scotland, the Orkney and Shetland Islands, the Faroe Islands, and along the coasts of France and the Iberian Peninsula. They had penetrated the Mediterranean, raiding the coasts of Spain, Portugal, and North Africa, even sacking Pisa and exploring the Italian coast. Norse traders were operating deep into Russia and Ukraine, and the first tentative steps toward Iceland had been taken. This was an age of extraordinary energy and violence. For the peoples who were raided, the monks of Lindisfarne, the farmers of East Anglia, the inhabitants of Nantes or Paris, the Vikings represented a catastrophe, a visitation of divine punishment. The famous prayer of the era, a furore normanorum libera nos, Domine, from the fury of the Northmen deliver us, O Lord, captures the terror these raids inspired. But for the Norse themselves, this was an age of opportunity. Young men who had no land and no prospects at home could win wealth, glory, and status through raids and trading expeditions. Successful warriors returned home with silver, slaves, and exotic goods that made them powerful and attractive figures in their own communities. The sagas, the great Norse narrative tradition, celebrated these men as heroes. It is important to hold both of these perspectives simultaneously. The Vikings were capable of extraordinary violence and cruelty. They were also farmers, craftspeople, poets, and explorers who built communities and contributed to the cultures of every land they touched. The truth of the Viking Age is more complex, more interesting, and ultimately more human than either the monster myth or the heroic myth allows. The first phase of the Viking Age was drawing to a close as the 9th century ended. The opportunistic raids were giving way to something more permanent: settlement, political organization, and cultural exchange. In the second great phase of the Viking Age, the Norse would not just be raiders and traders. They would become founders of kingdoms and discoverers of new worlds.